Okay, Dr. Olivia Carril has been studying native bees for over 25 years and is the co-author of two books, The Bees in Your Backyard, A Field Guide to North America's Bees, and The Common Bees of Eastern North America. She is currently working on a field guide to common western bees, as well as conducting several large-scale surveys of bees in northern New Mexico. Today we're excited to hear Olivia's talk titled Pollinator Networks in the Southwest, What Bee-Plant Relationships Can Tell Us About Habitat Health. Olivia, are you all set up?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you and see
Okay.
you and see your talk.
Perfect. Okay. And it doesn't look like presenter mode. I can't tell for sure what you're seeing. Just want to be sure.
It's full screen. Looks
Okay.
good.
Perfect. All right. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today. Today, I'm always excited to get a chance to talk to people about bees. It's something I've been studying for a really long time, as Maria pointed out. These days, I usually do it with my kids in tow, whether they want to or not. They have to join me in the field as I'm out looking for new bees. It's a job that never gets tiring. It is always fun because I'm always finding new things and bringing home interesting specimens. And one of my favorite things when I bring bees home is seeing them in their little boxes and seeing how on a certain day I caught this bee, and on a different day I found this other bee, and on this plant there was this. And anyway, all these ecological relationships kind of manifest in front of me before I open an Excel spreadsheet or do anything too wild and crazy. So that's kind of fun. I live in New Mexico, which happens to be a great place to live if you want to study bees without having to drive very far, because there are so many different kinds here. This doesn't have the numbers for all of the states on it, but it's enough to kind of give you the sense, which is that the Southwest is pretty much the best place to see a lot of different kinds of bees. And this can be seen in this image too, which shows the number of genera, that's plural for genus, of bees found in ecoregions of North America. And you can see that the hot deserts like the Chihuahuan and Sonoran are particularly good places to find lots of different bee groups. Interestingly, colder deserts like the Great Basin and the Mojave, which is kind of on the border there, also are great places to find lots of bees, as you can see from this image showing sort of the number of species for each of the different ecoregions, which is fascinating to think about, this landlocked basin there with so many different species in it. If we're going to talk about bees, I figure I should introduce you to a typical bee, and I'm going to do this as if I were a used car salesman trying to convince you of their awesomeness. So first of all, they have these incredible compound eyes that are able to see this huge range around them. They have ultraviolet capability, which means that while we see kind of from the red to the purple range of visible light, bees see the same range but shifted down just a little bit. So they don't pick up red so well. They don't have sensors for that, but they do see into the ultraviolet. So when we look at a flower and it looks like this, a bee would look at that same plant and see a bit of a different signal. It's communicating something different to the bee than it is to us. So just for fun, here's another one. I love these. In addition, they have 3 eyes on the top of their head. So they have 5 eyes total. On the top, those 3 eyes there are used for navigating, for kind of keeping an eye on the sun and being able to find their nest when they get back to it. Nests are often small and can be a little tricky to see. They have these extended floral scent detectors, also known as antennae. They use their antenna to pick up all of the different chemical compounds, floral volatiles that might be in the air and lead them to the best sources for pollen and nectar. And males come equipped with even a little bit extra on their antenna, which we think, in addition to some other uses I'll talk about in a minute, help them find females because they can smell the scent of a female, believe it or not. They come with built-in reusable grocery bags. I kind of wish this was me, or that my pants had giant pockets. I always forget my grocery bags. But on a bee, they're built in, and they have these special hairs, this sort of scopal hairs that grab onto pollen grains when they get shoved in there and take them back to the nest without them falling out. Sometimes they're on the underside of the abdomen, and sometimes you find those same things on the legs. This is a great way to tell if you're looking at a female bee ever, because only female bees gather pollen to take back to their nests. They also come with scissors on their faces built in, very useful for scraping hair off of leaves on plants, or for not just scraping off the hairs, but actually cutting pieces of leaves out to take back. And then they have really amazing wings that allow them to fly forward and backward and dive into narrow corolla tubes and flip upside down and go side to side and hover and all these amazing things. Females come with a sting. This is one of the things most people know about bees, is that they can sting. Only the female can. It's a modified ovipositor, and it comes standard on all females. They also have incredible mouth parts that they use to paint the inside of their nests so that it's waterproof or microbe resistant. They can use it as a straw to suck up nectar. They can taste different things. They can lap the tears out of the eyes of humans. This is a thing that happens in Thailand. They have interesting bees there, and sponging just the same way that a fly might. And they come with incredible legs that allow them to walk and to climb and to sort of crawl around inside their little nests and to clean their antenna. And they even can sometimes be electrostatically charged so that the pollen is attracted to their bodies. They come with knee pads and all sorts of other things. Okay, so that's a bee in general. When I was a kid, one of the shows that I sometimes watched, maybe you did too, maybe I'm dating myself, was this one where they did this, one of these things is not like the others, and I always did really well, so I like this one. And so we're going to play that a little bit today, and I want you to understand that there is one kind of bee that's very, very different from all of the other kinds. And it's not that bright green one. It is in fact the honeybee, one we know most about, the one that everyone knows that all of my kids' bee books are about is the honeybee, but it's not a good representative of most of the bees that you can find in North America or in the world, really. This is a more typical bee on a globe mallow, one of my favorite flowers. And this bee is solitary, meaning that she by herself gathers the pollen and nectar that she needs to provide for offspring, which are the result of her. She lays the eggs. There's no queen and workers. It's all her. She mates, she lays eggs, and she gathers all that they need. She maintains her nest. She does it all. Most of these bees nest in the ground. In New Mexico, where I am, it's about 70–75% of bees nest in the ground. The rest of them are nesting mostly in cavities in wood or hollow stems in plants, but not hives. Hives is pretty unique. And most bees do not make honey. In North America, the only one that makes honey is the honeybee. None of these bees make honey because they don't overwinter as adults. Honeybees do, and that honey is used to get them through the months when there aren't any flowers out. All of the features that I showed you on a bee and their solitary way of being are adaptations to a lifestyle that sort of revolves around plants and harvesting the pollen and the nectar that they find there. And that co-evolution and co-radiation between plants and the bees has led to somewhere between 20 and 30,000 species of bees worldwide, somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 in the US and Canada combined. And as I said, in the Southwest, thousands of those bees exist here. And at the same time, utilizing bees to move the pollen from plant to plant has led to incredible variation in the floral form, in floral color, in scent, and in size and shape of all of the flowers that we see around the world. The appearance and life histories of both of these organisms is driven in large part by the fact that they rely on each other. And though it's worth mentioning that we'll both really need each other, it's kind of a love-hate relationship that's going on here. Every grain of pollen that a bee harvests from a flower for its own benefit means that that pollen didn't land on a stigma and make a seed for the plant, right? So when one wins, the other loses to some extent. And so the appearance of these two organisms is also driven by their intense need to manipulate each other into doing whatever it is that they want. And to really make this clear, this is an example, and it's a rather extreme one, where this bee, it's called Rediviva. It's in South Africa, and it has incredibly long forelegs that it uses to reach deep inside a flower's corolla tube in order to extract not pollen or nectar, but actually floral oils that it uses to feed its offspring. And the corolla of the plant is extremely elongated in order to draw the bee in closer to touch the stigmas and the anthers and all of those things. And it's been found, this is so cool, that there's local variation in the length of the spurs. So some areas have slightly shorter spurs and other areas in South Africa have this plant, it's called a twin spur with longer spurs, and the bee leg length in that area matches the length of the spurs that are found where they are. So it's kind of incredible. So though maybe not always as extreme, there are many bees that are specialists, meaning that even when there's a wide array of plants around that they could collect pollen from, they limit themselves to some subset. So they only collect pollen from, say, all of the Asteraceae, or maybe they limit themselves to just sunflowers within the sunflower family. This is usually a relationship that holds true across the geographic range of the bee and also between generations. So here's a common specialist bee. If you've ever been out walking in the late summer, midsummer to late summer, you probably have seen this bee. And many of the bees in this group, they're called longhorned bees or melisodes, are specialists on sunflowers, which is why you usually find them there. This one's a male, and I just wanted to try and show you, let's see if I can pull this off here, what those males use those antennae for. I only learned about this a couple of years ago, and I was just fascinated. It's actually something he uses to keep the female either calm or in place. I'm not sure exactly, while he's mating with her. So it's kind of amazing. Moving on. Okay, so this idea that there are these specialized bees often leads to an idea that a specialist bee only visits, is the only visitor of a flower. So a specialist bee visits a specialized plant, and the two have this one-to-one relationship and are responsible for each other's success. And there are a few cases where that's true, where just one bee visits. This one's Andrena astragali. It's the wrong name for this bee because it visits a plant called death camas, zygodinus, which has toxic nectar and not many insects can visit. But this particular bee can and is likely the best pollinator of it. And then also that's the only plant that this bee visits. So it is a one-to-one relationship there. Here's another, this is a really amazing bee called centris, and many of, well, there's a couple species of centris that are specialists on creosote, and that's all that they visit. But in this case, the one-to-one relationship has more to do with the fact that there aren't any other species around here in that same genus, the Laria genus. Other centris species actually visit this plant, and they have an adaptation for collecting floral oils instead of pollen and nectar. So that's specialists. There are also a lot of generalist bees that'll visit anything, kind of do the smorgasbord thing, whatever's out there is just fine for them. And so one way to kind of think about all of these relationships together is to kind of visualize them in terms of what we call a plant pollinator network. So I'm going to make a really simple one here just to illustrate the idea, and then we'll get into some more complicated ones. So imagine for a second, these are all flowers that I can find in the area where I live right here, and on the top are also bees that occur with those flowers. And that's that longhorn, the melisodes bee that I talked about a minute ago, and of course it's a specialist on things in the Asteraceae. So I can draw a line from the bee to those two plants. Osmia, the mason bee up there, is a specialist on penstemon, so I can draw that line. Bombus, the bumblebees, are very generalist. They'll visit just about anything, although they are what we call floral constant. So on any one trip, they may only visit the sunflower, and another trip visit something else. But overall, they are pretty generalist. And the same is true for the green metallic sweat bee up there. So now, by drawing those lines, we can see that all of the bees and all of the flowers are actually connected to each other through these interactions. And if something changes in our network, say the penstemon goes away, there's this whole shuffling of things that has to happen. Maybe a bee drops out, maybe more interactions happen on a different plant because there's a little less of a floral resource. Or alternatively, if we add something, say an invasive species in an area, again, all of those connections and how each plant experiences the presence of this new plant change as a result of all of the connections. We use these in science a lot just as a model, as a way to visualize something that's kind of complicated and to think about bees and plants in a slightly different way. One of my favorites that's kind of looked at this is this paper, which came out close to 10 years ago now, not quite. And these people, well, where do I start? There's a man who lived 130 years ago named Charles Robertson, and he lived outside of Carlinville, Illinois, and he He was meticulous in his note taking, and he loved to go out to this same area. He was always in the same spot, and he would record which bees were on which flowers. And he left this incredible data set, all handwritten, in old school cursive. And scientists are able to take that and go revisit those areas and recollect data from the same place where he was at 120 years later. They chose just 26 of all of the flowers that he looked at to focus on. And they built a plant pollinator network that looks something like this. On the, the left side are all of the flowers, the 26 flowers, and on the right side are bees, not just the bees that they found, but also the bees that Charles found. And the color of the line between them indicates whether it was a bee that was there previously and isn't there now, or a bee that wasn't there before and now exists, or whether it's a stable thing that hasn't really changed over time. Overall, they found 109 bee species, but they found that only 24% of the original linkages had persisted. So there were several new interactions, but of the ones that Charles Robertson had recorded, only 24% were still there. So 407 of 532 interactions were gone. And because they had chosen to focus on the plants, none of those could be because the flower went away. It was all because the bees weren't there anymore. So this can sound a little bit alarming. It's probably not quite like it sounds. Just because the bee wasn't collected doesn't mean it's no longer in the area. It could just have moved on to dandelion or some other invasive plant that's in the area. All that's really changed is the network that we know of for sure. Also, many of the things recorded on their network were bees that are, in this case, you can see a list here that says nomata. There's like maybe, 10, 12 nomata species. Those are all cuckoo bees. They're bees that rely on other bees to collect pollen for them. And they're not, you can't even call them generalists. They just are what they are, but they aren't good representatives of a plant pollinator network because their reliance on plants is so sort of hit or miss. The other thing we don't really know here is how much time and effort Robertson had put into this compared to the researchers that came later. So maybe with more time, more would have been found. It's hard to say for sure. Anyway, nonetheless, the point is it's a great use of a plant pollinator network to learn something about changes in an area. So let's look at, this is a data set that I have. This one's from my master's work, and I'm starting with this one because it's the most complete one that I have with all of the names and a whole lot of bees that we can look at. So I worked in this area for 4 years. This is in South Central Utah in a place called Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. And over the course of my 4 years collecting there with a crew, I didn't do it by myself, we found a total of 660 different bee species. So that was 80,000 individuals spread across 4 years and about 2 million acres. And we spent about, 1,600 or so days collecting. And we found a lot of bees in these standardized plots that we'd set up. So the little yellow boxes are plots that were sampled every 2 weeks for the duration of the flowering season for consecutive years. So the data sets in there are pretty robust and fairly representative of all of the bees that can be found in the area. And so from this, I can make my own plant pollinator networks and kind of look and see what's going on. So this is for one plot, just one of my plots for 1 year. There were 30 bee species across the course of the year and 15 plant species. So the yellow circles are the bees and the blue circles are the flowers. And one thing I kind of love about this when looking at a plant pollinator network is that it really emphasizes the interactions over the species ID. So it makes the interaction stand out more. And I've often thought that maybe it would be interesting to sort of concatenate bee names with the plant names for what they visit so that we have to consider them together as an entity rather than as two separate things. It should just be one record. And I wonder how we would analyze our data differently if we did that. But the gray lines in between these indicate a connection between the two. That would be the concatenated part. So here I'm going to break down this whole giant thing according to the month. So you can see how it kind of shifts across the year. In May, there were just a few plants in bloom and a few things that interacted with each other. June was a great month for finding bees there. Interestingly, one of those plants was a very invasive species that's common in the riparian area where I was. And one of the bees that visited the most different kinds of plants is this a funny looking little bee that's called a small carpenter bee right here. And so you can see that. Asclepias, the milkweed, had a lot of different species on it in June as well. In July, despite wandering all over everywhere, I didn't find a single bee. Most of the plants had gone. It was kind of between the spring sort of rains and runoff and the monsoon season. In August, things picked back up again. And by September, we now have this complete pollinator network. So what's interesting is that I don't know if it was obvious. I'm going to show this again in a slightly different way to really emphasize the bees and the plants change dramatically from month to month, so that there's very seldom an overlap between months in which bees are present and participating in the making of that network for that month. There's a little crossover, but not a whole lot between months. And then the next thing that I want to show is this exact same plot a year later. So a year later, redrawing the same plant pollinator network, we found 46 bee species. It was a wetter year. It had been a great winter, lots of snow, so lots of early spring plants as well. And 33 plant species were seen and recorded for the same, this is standardized, so same amount of time spent in the plot, almost the same days, biweekly for each month. And so in May, the willow, which had bloomed a little early the year before, bloomed during the month of May, and I was able to collect in there and see that there's that the small carpenter bee again, still making a good showing. Hymenopapus came in during June and was good. July had bees in this year, which it hadn't had in the year before. August was quite good. Lots of the fall asters did really well. I got a lot of bees on Heterotheca and a couple different species of aster. And then finally in September, some of the even later ones came in, Grandelia, Erigeron, and Gutierrezia, and I got interesting bees there. So the point of those is just to show one thing, which is that bees vary a lot from year to year. They vary in terms of who's in the area, the number of species for each area changed, in terms of what plants are favored, and in terms of abundance and diversity. I also did this, and this isn't a true plant pollinator network, but again, the point of these is to model and sort of visualize really complicated data. This is for one bee, and the green circles here indicate the plot. So the bee was found in a lot of plots. This is one of my most abundant species. And the orange is the plants that it was visiting in that plot. And this is across the whole year. And so you can see that what plant was important and best visited in one plot is different from the plants that were visited when the bee was in another plot. So to kind of sum that up, bees vary not only from year to year, but also within a year, so that the same species of bee will visit different plants in different areas. And finally, I need to point out that bees vary from place to place. This is getting complicated, isn't it? So I looked at, how do I say this? I calculated how similar two plots were to each other based on which bee species were in there. And then I compared that to how far apart in terms of linear, as the crow flies, distance, and found that pretty much by the time you've traveled, 6 miles or so, the bees that are in an area have changed almost entirely. Great turnover in what bees are there, buffered by elevation and habitat, so that things at same elevation tend to stay the same for a little bit longer, but elevation still separates bee communities, although it doesn't separate the plant communities in quite the same way. So the plant pollinator network changes in this case because the plant stayed the same, but the bees kind of changed. All of which is to say that you never can tell what's going on with bees. It's just complicated. We do the best we can, but we'll never get these actual numbers because it's a moving target. It's always changing. With all of that said, all of that variability, one thing that stays the same, even as everything else changes, is that the nestedness of most of the plant pollinator interactions stay the same. So what this means is that if you look on this, kind of note that this is arranged with most of the interactions in the upper left corner and fewer interactions in the lower right corner. And this is fewer interactions than one would expect by chance. If we had scattered those pink spots, which indicate an interaction between a bee and a plant, if we'd scattered them, we might not have seen this empty area and the concentration of stuff up there. So we call this property nestedness, And it indicates that the generalist plants are interacting with many, both generalist and specialist bees, and that generalist bees are interacting with many generalist plants, as well as a number of bees, or bees that are not interacting with other plants. So here it is again, shown in a slightly different way. I want you to see that the shape of the network may change with each collecting period. So this is for one plot, a different one than we were looking at before. And it's showing each of the collecting periods that I had there during the early part of the year, split out by year. And so you can see that there are definite differences for each of the collecting periods across each of 3 years. But one or two plants kind of play the role of being a central hub no matter what, even though who is participating in this, plays the central pole. Thank you, Melanie. It doesn't change. And there's often some modality so that certain things interact with each other, but there's isolation between units. And the number of satellites, which is the bees that are kind of circling in orange there around a blue dot that is a plant, is higher than the number of plants. So there's interesting patterns that hold true even though who is creating that pattern is changing. So how can we use this to understand pollinator health in any meaningful way? How might these plant pollinator networks change in the face of grazing disturbance? How would fire disrupt a plant pollinator network? And does it reestablish with time in the same way after a fire goes through? And what about mega drought? So this is one of my plots that I'm sampling here in New Mexico. This is 1 year, and this is the very next year, the same plot. So with these mega droughts, what sort of changes might we see? And I'm not alone in asking these questions and trying to figure them out. Others have been looking at this as well with their own data in their own areas, trying to figure out how these plant pollinator interactions shift in the face of climate change and other things like that. But this is a new enough field of study that there doesn't appear to be any solid answers just yet, although a few things tend to hold true across these studies. So let's talk about this. It all comes down to nests and hubs. So in a healthy network, more specifically, in this case, I'll be using data from my study that's just wrapping up in Rio Grande del Norte National Monument here in New Mexico to really illustrate this. You can see that the network is likely always changing. It is a constantly changing and moving things between years, across seasons, and over large areas. But regardless, we can assess health based on the number of hubs. Typically, these are plants which are red on this image, and they draw in a lot of different kinds of bees, both generalists and specialists. And note from this way of looking at a plant pollinator interaction, an invasive species that's attractive to a number of bees is kind of equivalent to a native species that's also attractive to the same number of bees. So that's an interesting thing to kind of think about. And note also that a hub is the equivalent of a generalist, either a generalist bee or a generalist plant. So when you think about that for a minute, this is kind of similar. I don't know if any of you are familiar with macroinvertebrates and habitat quality, but generalists are often indicators of poor stream quality, and specialists indicate better stream quality. So it's important also to have a lot of satellites, especially satellites that are connected to few things, because those are often our specialists and are an indication of perhaps better quality. And ideally, of course, there are as many members as possible co-occurring together. And so there's a lot to kind of comprehend there and think about, but I would say in conclusion, I think that these plant pollinator interactions are pretty fascinating and beautiful ways to consider what's happening on a landscape. And it manages to go beyond just the list of bees and the list of plants that are in an area and consider their connections as the more important and maybe salient point to think about with these. They do vary a lot from time to time and place to place and wherever you are, but the central things, the patterns within them shouldn't change too much and should include having these big hubs with lots of little satellites around that, several of which aren't connected to many other things, indicating specialists and quality of habitat that can support specialist bees. That's a lot to kind of cram into 30 minutes. I hope I didn't leave you all too confused there, but gave you a sense for how cool plant pollinator interactions can be. If you have questions that we don't get to today, I put this up here because this is how you can reach out and find me, and I'd be happy to answer questions later as well.
Thank you, Olivia. Super interesting and really beautiful slides. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. And as a reminder, or if you just got here, I'll be pulling them from the Q&A box. It's the icon you see at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And if you see a question you would like answered, please like it and it'll move to the top so we can prioritize those. First question, we've got some big ones. First question is, in many of the areas we are working to restore, invasives are often the only dominant or the dominant form available to pollinators. When trying to restore ecosystems, in addition to just making sure we are replacing these non-native forms with natives, should we be taking care to consider which species / diversity of forms to take into account the pollinator community that has developed in the degraded habitat?
Yes. Yes, you should be taking that into account. If we think about this, and I'm going to try and stick to the theme of the plant pollinator networks, right? When you have that one invasive thing, you step one is done. You have your hub, right? That everything goes to, and they're often really attractive. That's part of what makes an invasive so hard to get rid of, is that it's so attractive, attracts a lot of pollinators, lots of seeds are set, and it outcompetes everything else. But ideally, other things would occur in the neighborhood that can attract some of those specialist bees and also pull away some of the generalists and add a little more, a few more vectors, I guess, onto whatever plant pollinator network you're trying to create. I think it's really important. So let's see, maybe the way to say this is, if you plant a plant that a lot of specialist bees are going to like, chances are good it's also going to be attractive to generalists. And so you can kind of check two birds with one stone there. You can bring in some of your more sensitive species in terms of the specialists, but you'll also be supporting generalists. So good plants for that would include things like the globe mallow. I mean, I'm in the Southwest, so pardon me if you're not, and this makes no sense, but globe mallows, cactuses, and anything in the Asteraceae. Penstemons would be really good. All of those support a lot of different specialists and could help with degraded habitat.
Awesome, thank you. Next question on the lung side also. How quickly can bees adapt to other invasive plants? At a Scotch broom, which is an invasive shrub, pull last summer to restore a Camas meadow, the Scotch broom were so full of bees before we started. So were there some hungry / were they hungry / doomed? Sorry,
I get it. So were there some hungry
Yeah.
or doomed bees after we finished? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. This is such a hard question, and bees don't make it any easier because they're, you know, they're a little like my dog that will just eat anything anywhere. They're very opportunistic. They will take advantage of any resource that's out there, and they tend, on the whole, not to be too picky. They're fairly resilient as far as organisms go. They're not quite as finicky as some others. And it can be so that, you know, you have some invasive plant and it's covered in bees and you pull it and you feel terrible. I've had the same thoughts about tamarix, because tamarix is actually really good for bees. But what I've found is that quite often on those good ones, they're there for the nectar and they're not there to get pollen for their offspring. And so it's important to realize that if you do remove those, in terms of what they need to make the babies that will come out next year, you're probably not removing something that they need. So doomed, no, probably not. Hungry, yeah, probably a little hungry, but they'll probably find something else to take its place.
And then there's a second part of that question, which you might have more to add to. How do we judge whether our pollinator projects are helping the biodiversity of pollinators?
I've been thinking about this one a lot, and I don't have a good answer. I don't have a tested answer yet. I have a hypothesis in my mind because I think about this in the habitats that I'm in. And one of the things I look for is whether I have more than just what I call the weedy bees, right? There are bees that are kind of like weedy plants and they're everywhere. And if there's a flower in the area, one of these is going to come in. That Ceratina, the small carpenter bee I showed, would be an example of one. Anything in the Halictidae family tends to be along those lines. But I tend to think of habitat quality for bees in terms of some of the rarer jewels that maybe don't show up unless it's a really good, high quality habitat, which would include your mason bees in a lot of cases. Wool carders tend to handle just about anything. Some of the more sensitive digger bees and things along those lines, Coletes sometimes, some of our mining bees, to me seem to indicate a better habitat. Do I have anything to back that up other than my own experiences? Not really, but it fits. You know, it's a model that we use for plants all the time. We can look at an area and say, this is heavily disturbed, and we know it by what's there. And I think we can do the same thing for bees with enough practice and experience.
Great. Next question. It's a multi-parter, so I can repeat if you need. Can you comment on using these amazing pollinator network maps to prioritize seed-based restoration? For example, this could inform what plant species to focus on for a seed increase effort, or should we focus on plant species that are more nuanced, assuming self-seeding of a particular plant would be increased with increased pollinator visitation?
I think, yeah, that's a hard question. Carrie, I would say it probably depends on the goal, right? In the one case, it seems like the goal is to focus on the plant. If the goal is to keep well, I guess the goal should be, right, to keep both the plant and the pollinator healthy and happy in an area. So maybe a little bit of both, really, maybe sort of a dual effort where you're putting in some plants that are going to provide for a lot of things all at once. So the things that are the hubs, right, the plants that have a lot of satellites all going around them there. But then also a few of the ones that are kind of on the side, but seem to be in the center of a mode that doesn't have anything else with it. Some of those isolated little communities that are out on the sides. Yeah, I think if I were in charge of the world, I might try and do a little of both of those, really, to make the plant pollinator network as complete as possible.
Great, I think we have time for a few more. Next question. Can you talk a little bit about how bees are able to respond to flowers in a given season? For example, I would think there would be less bees following a year with fewer flower resources, since there might have been fewer eggs laid by their mothers in the preceding season or year, but you showed how bee abundance seemed to match flower abundance. How do they do that?
This is a great question, and it's true. So generally speaking, if you look at the overall community, we find that a good flower year means that the next year there will be an increase in bee abundance, and a poor flower year, there is going to be much lower bee abundance. So you are absolutely right. We see that. It's confounded by the fact that, one, bees can move. So they come up, they don't find any flowers in an area, and they leave. They head off for something better somewhere else, or a particular little microhabitat like the one that I was in, which happened to be kind of a riparian area and a little bit of a dip. Lots of flowers came up in the really good wet year. And I think bees from other areas kind of, immigrated into that area. So I think there's this year to year sort of change. There's central place foragers like birds. You can imagine birds doing the same sort of thing, adjusting from year to year. And if you're static and staying in the same spot, what you see might be not the whole picture. But the other thing, and this is really complicated, is that a lot of bees do this, especially in the desert, and especially our ground nesting bees. They do something called bet hedging. So in a year where the soil is too dry, the temperature of the soil that they're in doesn't feel right, just doesn't seem like a good year, they can bet that the next year will be better. They can hedge their bets and wait in the ground a whole year and try and hope that the following year will be better. And so they don't all emerge every year, which can really throw numbers off. And it's one of the reasons I argue that you need to sample for multiple years if you want to know what's happening in an area, because some of those bees are like a seed bank and they don't come out every year.
Really cool. Next question. How do you structure meaningful monitoring if bee relationships change each year?
There you go. You sample for multiple years. I think the only thing that you can do is sample for multiple years and invest as much as you can into your monitoring effort. The more that's put into that that upfront collecting of as much as you can, the better you will feel about trying to come to some conclusions about what bees are doing. You know, we have all sorts of tools that we can use, you know, I just forgot the name of it, but curves that show us how far along we are in our collecting effort, whether we're getting more bees with more collection effort or whether we've gotten close to sort of tapping that out.
Okay, we have time for one more tiny question, so I'll ask this one, and I think a lot of people would want to know, has a bee ever made you mad?
Mad?
Mad.
Yes, I have been mad at bees on several occasions. Number one, when I swing and I should have got it in my net and I didn't. I am allowed to curse the bees at that time, even though I'm also proud of them for getting away. I get angry. And two, my favorite bee, just because we have such a long and storied relationship, is Diadasia. It's a specialist bee that visits either globe mallow or cactus, and it's the one I studied for my PhD. And it would not cooperate with any of the experiments that I needed to do in order to be successful. And I was very angry at it for not helping me more.
Good answers. So that's all the time we have for questions.
I'll just say, if you guys, I haven't read through all of these questions, but if you want to copy it and paste it in an email to me at Bees in Your Backyard, you're welcome to do that. I'm happy to answer them. I'll type out an answer and send to you.
Yeah, we can also leave them in the question and answer box. And if you have time over the break or like in the next few minutes to answer some, that would work also.
I'll do that. Yeah.
Okay. So we're moving into a break for 5 minutes. So that's 2:45 Pacific time. So we'll be back at 2:45.
Hi everyone, we're going to get started here again. We have 2 more talks for the rest of the day. And Akasha, if you're there, I'll go ahead and introduce you. There you are.